Greetings, welcome to Tribal Jazzman Scholar. I want to suggest that the world is getting better. I know that's a radical assertion. There's enough darkness out there, there's enough inhumanity to make anybody sick to their stomach. If you read the newspaper, and I don't suggest that you do it very often, or that you be very selective in what media you allow to contaminate and toxify your organism, if you do read it, you're going to get the idea that it's pretty dark out there. And in a way, that idea is not far from the truth. It's dark out there. There's a lot of horrific stuff going on in the world. What happens, though, is that the media sells itself on that darkness. We have a fascination with the abomination. It's what makes the traffic slow down in an accident. We kind of want to see somebody that's a little more pain than we're in. I remember my wife wanting me to read to her during labor with our first daughter some really dark stuff about a jazz musician and his heroin addiction, and later she told me, well, I just wanted to read about someone and wanted to hear about someone in more pain than I was in delivering that baby. So we do have this fascination with the abomination, and it's how the media sells itself a lot of the time. The good news just doesn't sell, but there's a lot of good news out there, and that's what I want to talk about. Both in terms of the individual acts of goodness and altruism that are all over the place that just don't get reported, but also the collective thrust of humanity, if I can make such a bold assertion. I believe humanity is getting better. I believe we're in the great turning. I believe it couldn't come a moment sooner. I believe humanity's autoimmune system is kicking in, to quote Paul Hawken in his book Blessed Unrest. But I really do see the institutions, the fundamental institutions of the world, legal institutions, economic institutions, educational institutions, medical institutions, child-rearing practices. In so many ways, there's a shift towards something that feels better, even if it's not being practiced. It's kind of like the typical hypocrisy is, well, I've got these values and they make sense, therefore I'm going to espouse them, and eventually maybe my behavior will catch up. Well, I think the nations of the world are generally espousing that such things as, well, colonialism and dominating other countries by force is not how things are done. 50 years ago, that's how things were done. 100, 200, 300 years ago, wasn't even questioned by the culture. Now, when I say culture, I mean the collective shared beliefs of a people. And that's what we need to see. The shift is happening. You go back 100 years, 200, 300 years, for the last 5,000 years, since the Bronze Age, human beings have been in a very warring, dark mentality that has expressed itself in institutions which are wildly incongruous with the values that seem to be presenting themselves throughout the world. Altruistic, benevolent ideas about how we're supposed to treat one another that seem to be gaining traction. Paul Hawken has a book called Blessed Unrest, and he has a website where he's been cataloging these organizations that have popped up around the world over the last 15, 20 years, and he says there's 250,000 organizations dedicated to principally three things: environmental healing, the rights of disenfranchised groups, human rights kind of a orientation, and then the protections and rights of indigenous populations. So that organizations are springing up around the world, and he has a list of them in one of his presentations scrolling on the screen, and he says we'd have to sit here for 4 days to see all of them scroll by. And he calls that humanity's autoimmune response. Joanna Macy and David Corton have coined the phrase the great turning. At least I believe it's their term. The idea that we're in a turning, we're in a shift. Thomas Berry, the late cultural historian and theologian, says that the earth has, for the first time, has turned over the control of its own destiny to its most evolved organism, the Homo sapien. It's like this sort of creative, artistic, brilliant, beautiful, poetic creature that's also complex and full of its darknesses, but that it's sort of given over the reins to us of its future. We've never controlled the biosphere. Now we control the fate of the biosphere. It's in human hands. In his book, The Dream of the Earth, he said it's the dream of the earth to give that to humans. And what will humans do with it? Now, what will we do with that power? And will we heal ourselves? And anyway, we're at a transition. We have to do something. I believe we're doing it. I believe it's happening. And this is not a Pollyannish view, and I'm not sitting back on my laurels going, well, it's all getting better, I'll just sit here and watch. No. But it's about hope. It's about trying to inspire an epidemic of hope, because when we're hopeful, when we're not sure, when we're in uncertainty, as Joanna Macy says, we're in that knife's edge of dark, light, hope, despair, and that hope has a propulsion to it that comes from the weight of despair. That when the hope shows itself again, we reach for it ever more tenaciously, with more fervor and intensity. And I teach 10-year-olds, I teach 5th grade, and I can't tell them we live in a dark world that's getting darker, because that's not how I see it, and that's not what I'm willing to believe. So I think we're in the great turning. I think Paul Hawkins' autoimmune model for all these organizations, that the Gaia, the earth, the living earth, is healing itself. I think it's happening. It doesn't mean we're not in for a challenging ride. But I think about collective institutions. Slavery, just to take one institution, slavery is still practiced throughout the world. Child slavery is an epidemic in itself. And but no country legalizes slavery any longer. And that's new. For 5,000 years we've had legalized slavery, and it's no longer legal. Those kind of shifts are legal protections for disenfranchised groups, whether they be ethnic minorities, gays and lesbians, women, others, people that generally were not empowered in our patriarchal social structures, have become more empowered through legal protections. It's not perfect, but this stuff's unprecedented, and the rate of change is unprecedented. We are in an awakening. Human beings have this unique ability to evolve our consciousness. Our physical evolution is totally dependent on long periods of time. But because we have culture is that information, knowledge that's fed to us through our group, whether we're with the Inuits of Alaska, or the Aboriginals of Australia, or the Shipibos of the Amazon. Wherever we grow up, we're given the ideas and values and practices and thought patterns and cosmologies of our social group. And that stuff changes over time, and the rate of change is kind of up to us in some ways. It seems to be we can evolve that. And it looks like that's what we're doing. So with that, Tribal Jazzman Scholar will propose that we are in the great turning, and I will hold that hope in my hand, and I will try to articulate it for others, and most notably my students, who are coming into a world with every reason to be hopeful, but to be dedicated to that model of change that seems to be emerging. Thanks for joining me.